what I've been hearing from friends, colleagues, patients, and Alazans is that at least in the people, all those people that I know, the majority of them have a similar kind of resonance. I still think we're probably in the minority, but the resonance is that I hear from so many people, oh, good thing I did that last month, or good thing I did that in the last year, because I'm already set up for this. It's okay. So even though there may be this kind of panic about uncertainty in various ways, biological or financial, people seem to be prepared for this, at least a lot of the people I'm in contact with. And that's exactly, I think that's not a coincidence. Obviously, people resonate with Analytica, New Clinic, myself, whatever, are on a similar kind of wavelength. We're moving in a certain direction. This is why I'm trying to be inspired about this. The inspiration is that whatever, our time has come. Strangely, a few astrologers have consulted with me and say that's true in terms of our cohort. I mean, I know everyone's not of the same cohort, but I'm saying that I've often talked about the cohort of what I call the promised generation, which some people called Generation X in the past. I call it the promised generation because people born in the 60s and 70s, their ambient background and fundamental development was at a time of radical transformation and openness. And that sort of disappeared from the 80s onwards. So this cohort, which also happens to be smaller, is sort of overshadowed in the shadow of the non-silent majorities of the baby boomers and the baby boomers' children, at least the children of the baby boomers who waited until they were older and had already achieved a lot and moved in a different direction. So I'm really hoping that this generation and anyone who feels resonant with it is going to see this as a time to make an impact, which essentially, if you follow astrology or give a shit about it at all, seems to be what is being told. So for me, and starting to reflect on this about 2 weeks ago, when we all went into more isolation, my plan here is to talk about the social implications of this, the socio-political economic implications of the new world, as I call it, first, and then move towards the psychoanalytic as a bridge in the middle, and how that can be transformed, and or why analysis already exists as a perfect operation or practice for the new world, and then end more on the virus and the actual aspects of the pandemic and the biological medical aspects, and maybe that'll lead into the discussion as well. But I guess my first reflection then was on the idea that I started calling the old world the old world. Some people who know me know that one of my symptoms is that I'm extremely nostalgic. I, at some point though, realized that it wasn't a nostalgia per se for everything in the past, but was particularly a nostalgia for the times I grew up in, which also happened to be these times I'm talking about. Sometimes I started talking about it as a nostalgia for the future, which to me, what was going on in those times, I mean, really through the 20th century, but leading up into the 60s and 70s, especially, was almost ahead of its time and couldn't hold. So much of what was happening in forecast at that moment, I believe, was a kind of overture operatic to the future, which then could not hold and broke down, or to use a psychoanalytic approach, the opening up of such symptoms or the liberation of repressions was so dramatic that it opened things up too quickly. The same thing can happen in medicine. When you actually are healing, you can heal too quickly and get into trouble from the actual healing. So maybe this is something we can look at as entering into the possibilities that were forecast at a certain time. So the old world to me is before 2000. Anything that happened in the old world, when history still existed. So the way I'm going to tell the story is that the struggle, the survival struggle of animals goes through a major transition at a certain point with human beings. Hegel is the master on this. The master-slave dialectic initiates history as an extension of the animal master-slave struggle to the death. And we have this going on for thousands of years in different ways. Hegel's work phenomenology of spirit details this. It's a precursor to Freud. Freud's one of the commentators or the discoverers of the aftermath of that, I believe, which is basically that the story wasn't complete. The end of history as we know it, as Hegel elucidates, and he elucidates the psyche, the mind, the spirit better than anyone before him, did not enter a state of completion where mutual recognition between subjects in a society, a kind of republic, the dream of the Greeks. It did not take place in the way that Hegel imagined, but I don't think he's completely off base here. I think that there's something in the Greeks and in Hegel that's essential and can and or almost inevitably will take place, but maybe we can understand why it didn't in the 20th century and especially the last 20 to 40 years. There's many cultures, the Mayans most famously, who talk about the end of history and the end of the world in 2012 or this period. To give a couple of interesting, I'll often go between ancient wisdom or science and modern science or wisdom to try to show, even though they're different formats, that they are equally valid forms of logos. So, for example, Terence McKenna, who explored altered states of consciousness, also with some colleagues developed some high-level computer mathematical modeling based on the I Ching to show that the rise in innovation or novelty exponentially and logarithmically went up from thousands of years ago in history to the point that we're at now in the 2012, or what I'm calling the purgatorial phase. Okay, the old world is pre-2000, and that's historical. History was necessary as a way of extending the master-slave dialectic and moving out and away and beyond it. But at a certain point, it reaches its end point where either we're going to crash back into an animalism, not very likely, fall back a little bit and restart the process of extension over and over again, or enter into some other phase. And to the degree that it's happened before, we haven't entered into another phase. I'm seeing now 2000 to 2020 as what I'm calling a purgatorial plateau. A purgatorial plateau with an abyss underneath it as a possibility. So this is the end, it seems, of the plateau, possibly. If the plateau, so I'm not nailing it to an exact date like 2012, which is absurd. Of course, the mistake that most humans make and most mathematicians is that they want a discrete number and a logical binary answer. It doesn't work that way. However, a discrete point can be a reference to a general continuum or a plateau. This is where mathematics goes in terms of continuum theory and group theory these days anyway. The point being that 2012 becomes a mythical signifier, but in reality, it probably refers to a spread of this area that I'm calling now the 2000 to 2020 purgatorial, although you could probably make extend it in both directions if you wish, in different ways. But the essence of the plateau is that we're in even before this event happened in the past month or two, I'd already been feeling like more and more strange experiences of time and history. I also am passionate and or obsessional about culture and ideas, tracking hundreds, thousands of books, films, etc. that I'm passionate about, ultimately as a way of being, not as history. But I think both that I or we are trapped in history to the degree that we reference it as something of the past from a certain time or a certain author, and that we need to move beyond that. But it's hard to move beyond that without losing something essential about all of those diversities, all of those microcultures in a way. There's so much important, brilliant microculture and creations in the 20th century alone, innovation, as McKenna was mapping, compared to previous times, that it's mind-blowing. And it's all in the process of being forgotten right now, dissolved by the state we're moving into, the virtual. It doesn't have to be dissolved. What we've learned from the elaborate diversity of history and cultures is that we could bring that forward into the virtual. However, what I see now is that when I go on, for example, Amazon to search for books that used to come up, because I could use the special search engine instead of the one where they picked out they thought what I wanted. Either well-meaningly, they were just guessing and reducing it always further and further to the bottom line and leaving out so much greatness and diversity, or more insidiously, that they wanted purposely to guide me into something that they wanted to sell. And it's easier to sell the same thing over and over again. So I've seen it's harder and harder to actually seek out an obscure reference that's essential. I mean, for me, this is a person who created something that I have to struggle to even find in a search if I remember it in my own memory. Maybe Fahrenheit 451 comes to mind here for a different reason. But if I don't spell everything in exact detail, it won't show up. And even when I do, it seems to be disappearing. So we're at a transition point where we need to bring everything that we've learned from our time in the old world into the new world. Hopefully, at least the quote good things that I'm talking about. The purgatorial years, the plateau now will be, who knows what it's going to be like. I'm going to sketch out some possibilities of what we could make it. Obviously, of course, it could be business as usual. A lot of people, myself even, a lot of things you want to just go back to. Can't we just go back to the way it used to be? Or there obviously will be a hunger for the things that we've withdrawn from various experiences of consumer culture. I'm sure that we're all having the experience of both withdrawing from going to restaurants or buying products, retail products or events, and at the same time thinking, well, actually, I don't really need to go to those things. I'm kind of happy that they don't exist, so I don't have to be drawn to go to them. But at the same time, we certainly don't want to continue to live in this state. What's missing, of course, is being able to replace that with something else, something like contact, something like creation. We're doing the best we can here virtually, and we're going to keep doing that. But I hope that we're able to find a certain combination balance between that real contact and the virtual, without the need for an obscene, I guess, what we might have called the spectacle before, which has taken over our lives to such a great degree. So this aspect of the purgatorial plateau, it sort of refers to the Mayan calendar as well, in the sense that there was a time out of time. Many cultures have a time out of time or out of history. Even the very structure is that time and quantification and history, the work week is profane, and that needs to be balanced with the sacred, always a time out of time. In even our version, there's the weekend, there's some version of that. So we're entering into a scrambled period where we may restructure that relation between the sacred and the profane, hopefully for the best. So also, of course, I will reference some of my biggest passions and influence, Deleuze and Guattari, psychoanalyst, philosopher, whose work, Capitalism and Schizophrenia, I see still as probably the best model manual of what's going on and what's been going on and possibilities for the future, especially the second volume, Beyond Anti-Oedipus, which is The Clearing Away, which is less often read and is called 1,000 Plateaus. Perhaps that's one answer to what could happen after a purgatorial plateau. An infinity of plateaus or different worlds. This is a way of answering to identities, subcultures beyond what those are. To grasp on, to lock on to an identity or a subculture is to, at the one hand, fight to be heard and recognized, at the other, to consign yourself to a limitation, another in-group, another identity that's fixed. To enter into the possibility of plateaus or multiple universes that are continually being in the process of being constructed, whether it's you as an individual being a different person in a different place in each year or each day, or whether it's various collectives or institutions that are being constructed and disassembled. This is open to us now, and it's probably a better way than having to latch on to an individual identity or a biological or religious or cultural group. At least it seems so to me. So these ideas of multiple worlds, logics, different logics of worlds, whatever, the Star Trek approach to the universe. This is sci-fi is highly relevant to us now. This seems the sort of things we should be consulting in this period. Culturally, just to go into it for a minute, I won't always give references to what I'm talking about, and it's reference. I could give you the references if you wish. You can always follow up with me. There's always multiple references behind what I'm saying, but I take responsibility for that it's influenced, and I've reconstructed or remade it in my own way. But essentially, after the Middle Ages, there was an opening up of entrepreneurialism, artisan creators. A different world began to emerge financially, politically, economically, institutionally. And at some point, this was say 16 to 1800s, at some point from the 1800s to the 2000s, there was a kind of reversal of that. Economically, old feudalism, hierarchical structure, the master-slave dialectic started to take control of what was free marketism. So the idea is that free marketism, mercantilism, exchange is part of the innovation of the highest level of both individual freedom and collectivism. But its artificial takeover by top-down capitalism or state totalitarianism is unpleasant and unworkable. The same thing culturally. There are texts that will outline the emergence of the public space, in a sense that there was no public space before the 1600s, and that the idea of the public space that emerged with cafes, salons, pubs, the early journals, novels, this was about the mass of humans emerging out of an institutional structure and creating a public space, a free and open public space that was creative and spiritual. It was the beginning of removing the spirit from religious doctrine, whatever it is, from churches, and putting it into the hope and experience of human relations individually and together. And it's not necessarily anybody's fault that at some point that began to be taken over again. So that the emergence of education and enlightenment through discourse, through sharing ideas in every man, the demos or the people would begin to arise and create their own structures and institutions outside of a controlled institution. But the idea of controlled universities and newspapers and magazines and experts took over eventually in the 1800s and onwards, and perhaps there's been a struggle since the 1800s between the autonomy of sovereignty and the individual breaking free from that institutionalization and the reappropriation or the recontrol by institutionalization, something that Deleuze and Guattari talk about in their manual, this back and forth struggle. Is this moment a possibility for that to take place again? People have talked about it happening in digital space, in virtual space with the internet. The internet begins as a DIY place for the most anarchic, individuated creators to find new free technology to be more free and more collective, to be free from those that have the power and money to control communication. But that anarchism, to be free to communicate, also leads immediately to what is inappropriately seen as its opposite, a kind of communalism or communism. It is not necessary that this idea, obviously macro politics, Republican and Democrat, is the same stupid game that people have been stuck playing for a long time, or the idea that a kind of anarchic libertarian freedom is on one side and a kind of collective communalism is on the other. Just go back to Kropotkin's anarcho-communism, the idea of mutual aid, or simplify it to mutual aid. What is mutual aid? It's not Marx's give what you have or what you can to those who don't. It's not a victim mentality. It's the idea that first comes the idea of freedom and struggle with and against others, and then that leads to the possibility of the joy of sharing or giving. This is actually closer to the Greek idea, which Hegel and Hegel's commentators eventually say was the problem throughout history, that you can't simply give people rights. You have to help them, enable them, facilitate for them to find their own path, their own way, and to struggle. I think this comes out in Freud's invention of medicine, basically, that there's something insidious and controlling about the well-meaning doctor who wants to fix everyone. Whereas if you simply try to meet the subject, the patient, where they're at, and try to explore their universe inside of their universe to help facilitate them to find their own construction, that seems more open and honest, and ultimately maybe the only way that people change themselves. At least this was the wager of psychoanalysis, which I'm trying to make a case for on a broader level, that it originally was created to solve the limitations of medicine and psychiatry, but ultimately in the end for Freud would also solve the alienation of society and political and educational structures. He talked about the 3 impossible professions, which in my reading is basically doctoring and education and government, and that ultimately the solution to medicine or doctoring for him was the possibility of the self-doctoring, of facilitating someone to come to be their own doctor. And of course, that only existed in the form of analysis or some kind of better therapy or psychiatry. But Freud did not, he was not able to go back to what he wanted to, which is to find a way to rejoin that to the biological and to medicine. Although I've taken that up as a major part of my own life's work, and I'm trying to return to that in this crucial moment because of the panic and pandemic that's surrounding the virus that we'll get to eventually. So there are models for what this kind of new society looks like in various places that have already been sketched out over decades and centuries of recent times, in terms of the possibility of balancing a kind of individual civil liberties, which America was originally based on. It's not the majority rule. It's based on the attempt to, above all, protect the absolute minority. That's not a minority identity or group. That's the radical that comes from outside, always the one you don't expect. The absolute singular against the 99.99%. That can't always be done in certain practical circumstances. But to have that as a mode and a model first is something that we've lost touch with, destroying civil liberties in recent years. Right now, of course, in the purgatorial period, which begins with Y2K and 9/11 and ends with Corona pandemic, we have various reasons and excuses to destroy civil liberties further. Obviously, some people are aware of that, and that's problematic. It's not necessary to do one or the other. It's possible to be collective and communal and retain civil liberties. Not always easy. It's an ongoing dialogue and dialectic, but that's what was happening in the Middle Ages onwards, and that gave rise to the French and American and other revolutions. It was this balance, and that was part of what was going on, and that perhaps we can revitalize right now. All right, I'm gonna take a little break for a second. Just glance over the questions and before I move to another subject. When I decide to give a presentation, it always begins with a series of random associations, which then will get more amplified into, okay, here's a time and a place I want to do this. I'll outline a sketch. The sketch is very logical and mathematical on many levels. I want it to be concise. So of course, I'm always presenting a lot of complex information. I don't expect everyone to take it in. Doesn't matter. Hopefully you'll think about it. You'll go and research it. What I write then, when I translate that structural outline that I want to be able to be fragmentary so I can still be a little bit live and let new things come into the association, I'm still going to translate that into more basic language for the advertisement so it makes sense, so that somebody actually wants to come. And hopefully I've done that. My point being, if you refer at any point back to what I've written, I'm going to talk about all of that, and every sentence and every word is constructed purposefully. So I'm going to try to answer to every part of that mathematical proof in a way, if I can. All right, let's see here. All right, coronavirus. Yeah, people want to hear about the coronavirus. Okay, all right. Let's see. Let's talk a little bit. Let's switch to that subject and talk a little bit about the coronavirus, and then we'll go back to, we'll backtrack. We'll go from the end, which is social history, back to the biology of the body, and then we'll try to find the schism, the midpoint in between, which is how does one operate? How does one make choices? How does ethics, or analysis equals ethics in my book, which is beyond morality. Psychoanalysis equals ethics. Ethics is about free choice, the free choice that a subject has to make and take that risk in order to learn from it and make another choice, and in relation to others. That will perhaps be the end result of trying to answer to the schism. But if we sort of reverse back to the biology, well, I was never interested in biology or medicine. When I was young, I became passionate about psychoanalysis because it was operating with between the psyche and the social, and also because it seemed to integrate the mind and body in a certain way. But after I started practicing as a psychoanalyst and a philosopher, I became interested in medicine and biology, neuroscience. How is it possible that psychoanalysis can answer to what Freud wanted, which is to bridge these two things? That's where he started. How is it possible that a piece of information, a word or an image, gets stored in the physical biology, the flesh, and that leads to a physical event like a disease or a symptom, and or that spreads psychosocially and creates another event or a symptom? So there's no way to talk about any of this for me. There never has been for 30 years, other than to be able to move between the continuum of the physical, material, real, biological body, the individuated psyche, the social, cultural psyche or information. And this is a key moment to be able to use this as a case for all of this, if possible. So anyway, at that point, while I was practicing and teaching, I went back to medical school to try to learn for myself, both to apply it to my own body, but also out of curiosity and passion in the work. I've been trying to talk about this integration in various domains. And as I often mention, still very distressing to me that no matter what domain I'm going into, scientists, artists, doctors, psychoanalysts, people have a mild curiosity about looking at the integration or the bridge, but don't usually follow up on it. I believe that this is also part of the essential practice of the future in order to survive, that if we're not able to enter the integral, to see how the dispersal of multiplicity and diversity that opened up over the past century can find a way to be integrated without universalized, then we don't have no hope. Doesn't have to be a return to a master, a universal, and or left into a chaos, a relativism, or a nihilism. It's possible to retain the diversity and see how each approach is able to translate, be similar to or different from the other approach, similar to the political relation between individuated and collective subjects. So what is a virus? This is a quote from myself because I've said it a million times to patients and friends, trying to have them understand. A virus is not alive. A virus exists between the gene and the mean, between the sign and the signifier. A virus is information, and we better know what to do with it. So when I had this revelation, it blew my mind. I refer you to Arthur Young's Reflexive Universe, where he describes 7 levels of being on Earth, from light to atoms to molecules to animals to humans, and looks at a hierarchical integral structure where you can see that a virus is the most advanced form of formed matter, of molecular structure, whereas bacteria is the lowest form of life or plant life. So it's the end of one cycle and the beginning of the next cycle. A parasite is an early form of a whole other level of cycle, which is an animal. It's very useful to look at this structure. I was going to use it as the image for this, but there was too much information and it didn't show up. But I'd be happy to send it to anyone or recommend the book, which I think may be out of print, but because these great obscure geniuses fall into complete forgetting. Anyway, a virus is a code, and actually it seems that this event is bringing this idea forward to more and more people. So that in itself is actually interesting and useful. A virus is a piece of information. It is the same as DNA, essentially. I mean, it's not the same, but it exists on the same level. A piece of code that is only held together by a container. In this case, it happens to be a kind of fat, and the code is not alive. And the code has to assume something else, invade something else. What are we gonna bring politics into this? Is the virus an evil code that wants to invade or rape something in order to get its agenda done? Or is it possibly symbiotic to us? Is it possibly doing something for us that we don't even understand? Not that it understands, because it doesn't have a central intelligence or nervous system. But there are some references to doctors and scientists that will show that viruses are used even in our own body in order to heal ourselves, to rebuild tissue or to reconstruct tissue or to produce symptoms or events when we need help with a bigger problem. So viruses, bacteria, fungi, parasites, they're all part of our society, the society of our body, which again, this is why we can say that this question of the virus mirrors the question of the social transformation that we're going through, which is basically that we have to understand the complexity of a society or a collective. It's the same with our body. So, of course, the whole idea of a virus only began to be talked about 100 years ago. We seem to forget this, except the traditional medicine of all cultures. I'm going to often reference traditional Chinese medicine because it's simply the most detailed and elaborated and most scientifically tested over the years of traditional medicine. So it gives us a good example. But essentially in my studies and practice and introducing of these methods, most of the same patterns of understanding of theory and diagnosis and treatment exist across the board in all cultures, in all histories of medicine. Some are more simple, some are more complex, but they're all very simple. And in modern times, we've obviously added levels of complexity and control that surpass those, that give us infinite benefits. And also we've created many problems and a lot of harm because of that. If you look at Reich's work, which people know I'm passionate about Reich did not elaborate psychoanalysis per se. He did in the early days. He returned psychoanalysis to medicine and biology and did something that nobody else did, which Freud also wanted to do. And his work is invaluable. But even his epidemiological, sociological work, he outlines how social diseases, epidemic and environmental diseases, have basically gone from being 90% of symptoms and death prior to the 20th century to being about 10% in the 20th century. So social diseases, which compose the majority of what we know of as death and disease for centuries, was mostly eradicated by intelligence, by changes, by the very procedures. Some of the procedures that we're trying to put in place right now are good and mixed with a lot of overreaction and panic. But these are a lot of the educational procedures and social changes that helped us overcome that. Very useful. Once that disappeared, we were face to face with individual lifestyle diseases, which is where Freud comes in. They were already studying physioneurosis or actual neurosis, nervous diseases before Freud, and psychoneurological diseases as well, which are slightly different. Physical nerve diseases accounts for what later became called stress by Hans Selye, stress diseases, and still accounts for the majority of disease and death that will ever take place in the times that people know. These are the things that people should be concerned about, but even when they're told about them, they don't change their behaviors. Okay, but if some strange evil invader like a virus comes along, then people get scared shitless. And we can talk about the psychological aspects and the real aspects. What are the real aspects of a virus? What are the social aspects of what's happening and what can be done? And ultimately, what are the psychological aspects also? How is it that this becomes a phobia, a hysteria, a paranoia for any given individual or group or collective society? These are all, we could be asking all these questions instead of fighting over one versus the other. Is the virus real? It seems to be, obviously. Is it causing all the things or leading to all the things that are talked about in the news? Probably not. But we have to make our own decisions. I try to shed some light as much as I can, and we can talk about it in the discussion. About 40 to 70,000 people die of basic flu viruses every year in America, a couple million every year in the world. I doubt that this virus will kill as many people or hurt as many people as the flu does every year, which many people have already talked about. It does seem to be more contagious in a unique way and more dangerous for reasons I'll go into in a minute. I don't want to spend too much time on these facts because they're out there, you can research them, etc. Everything I'm saying, well, half of it is based on my clinical and research experience of 30 years in a general sense. The other half is based on actually looking at a lot of the different stats, both in the mainstream and just taking a different reading of them and alternative approaches. Going back to this idea of the epidemic, I mean, epidemic doesn't mean anything relating to disease. Epi means out of, arising out of, demos means the people. So anything that arises out of the people is an epidemic. So what this really is a viral epidemic, not an epidemic, except that it also seems to be a signifying epidemic more than ever. Pan only means everywhere. So as opposed to an outbreak and out of somewhere, this is the ultimate epidemic. The pan is the ultimate epi. So it's a pan epidemic, to be more clear about what the signifier would be. Or it is a viral pan epidemic that has led to a signifying pan epidemic. Not that it has to be one or the other. They're both taking place, which is what I'm trying to address. The psychosocial changes that are going to take place as a result of this, as well as the medical changes. And I think people could probably see by now that the psychosocial changes are going to be much more intense and radical and transformative than the biological, for better and for worse. For one reason, because the biological aspects are not nearly as scary or dangerous or problematic as most people think. And two, because for all of its problems and myths, the overreaction and overresponse to it, which could be damaging to people's lives and psychologically, financially, economically, in the real, probably more so. But I don't even mind that because maybe it won't be. Maybe it will be even better. But that overreaction also is going to seriously limit this on some level. It's not necessarily the best way. I pull up some stats here that I have from somewhere which show how, at least so far, but we don't know very much. There's no clarity out there right now, so don't pretend there is. I'm not pretending there is, but at least rudimentary stats show that Korea and China were much better at dealing with it already than the rest of the West. What are the two major differences? One is that they introduced a different approach, more direct testing and quarantining, that is more scientific tracking of the actual contagion and less general pandemic lockdown, which doesn't seem to be useful on a biological level, or it seems to be the least useful approach to it. Number two, they also seem to be using some actual physical treatments that we haven't started to use. But again, we don't know about that, except that I will mention, for informational purposes, that this French doctor that discovered a quinine derivative with a small test works very well is not unique. There are many scientific studies out there already showing this. It also has a long history and tradition, both in traditional Chinese medicine, African medicine, more modern homeopathic medicine, all have millions of cases and information about the idea that quinine, which comes from a certain tree, is a treatment for malarial type diseases. Again, it's confusing because malaria is not a disease that comes from a certain thing like an evil invader. In this case, malaria is a type of disease. It's not only a particular malaria, but malarial has come to mean a type of disease that reacts in the body in a certain way, where the body tries to fight it off and it's stuck and it can't fight it off. It's halfway between a chronic disease that's impregnated for a long time and an acute disease where someone mounts a resistance and it's painful and it's over. This is a malarial disease. It has a history in traditional medicines and modern homeopathic medicine. And in just a purely empirical medicine that doesn't think in terms of cases and long scale understanding like Western medicine and science, it also has a history, because just the empirical derivatives of the cinchona bark, the quinine, are already known to inhibit this type of disease. So someone using a logic of thinking of and an understanding of these patterns of traditional medicines, this is what Steiner tried to do when he discovered that when he observed that the way that mistletoe operated in the wild, in the plant world, looked like something that could treat cancer, and then they put it into medical trials and it's statistically significant. That doesn't mean, of course, that it cures all cancer, because cancer is a complex disease that we can't go into right now. However, also same with the quinine. All diseases are complex. The power that we gained only in the last 100 to 200 years, and the understanding of things like bacteria, viruses, microbes, cleanliness, it's all very useful. But the idea that we're going to discover the answer and that there's one disease and one cure, that doesn't exist except in rare circumstances. And the ones we've eradicated are those simple ones. What we have left is complex diseases. We need to go back to complexity to understand them. Quinine significantly, scientifically inhibits the symptoms and the contagion dramatically. It has side effects too if used in its synthetic form. So just as people say, it's a risk. Do we have time to test it out? Are we going to go in there and take a chance? Who knows what's going to happen? The Koreans and the Chinese seem to have taken the chance to use things at all measures, that is, drugs that might have side effects or dangers without having been tested very much, or being consented to, quarantine measures which go against some of the basic principles of liberty that the West has learned, and they seem to have contained the virus. Again, there's so many variables. I don't know if these are all true. I'm not really interested in arguing these points. I'm interested if people have questions, if there's something new that they might be able to learn from it, as I am myself. I'm interested in fielding all information on what this could possibly be. So what are the effects? Let's see. Well, I only presented the idea that Freud initiated his studies in neurology, not psychiatry. He wasn't interested in controlling difference or madness. He was interested in how information gets stored in the body and mind and continues to persist. The sign and the signifier. That was his first work in neurology. He was even drawing neurons in the laboratory. And then he went into, because he's a deep synthetic thinker of the integral, what he called metapsychology, which is to understand the psychology of psychologies on the big picture and try to understand this in a philosophical sense. So he went from the absolute bottom to the absolute top, or the absolute detail of the biology and the neuron to the absolute global philosophy of what mind could be. And in the end, neither gave him the absolute answer. I would say that psychoanalysis was a theory practice devoted to answer to the schism between those two, or along the continuum. Just like I'm saying that it's in a way an answer to the schism between the question of medical diseases and social transformation right now. All right, let me take a break here and see what's going on. Yes, sorry, I can barely keep up with what I'm saying. Well, I'm not really getting to a lot of the questions. I'm perusing them, but most people aren't really putting them forward anyway. So I think soon I'll bring it to a close and we'll try to get into more of a discussion, which might be interesting. And anybody who wants to follow up with the possibility of a recording, hopefully, assuming it works, and or references or information, feel free to write me, scott@analytica.org, or go to one of our websites at analytica.org or newclinic.org. Let's see here. What about the virus? Okay. Contagion. Freud studied contagion on the level of the sign. One of his great interests was in group psychology and dismantling it. Of course, some of the psychologists around his day analyzed group psychology. In a way, this was the coming out of what was invisible. To actually show people that they were hypnotized, prey to a group hypnosis, was only possible at that time. And Freud wanted to actually find ways beyond just showing that it existed to do away with it. So it's one of many other things that psychoanalysis is, a practice of individuating from hypnosis and the group mind. Once you've individuated, there can be impasses about that. The question being how to relate again to the other or the social. So I think there are answers to that too, which Freud did not have, that Lacan tried to answer to, and that we're trying to answer to in Analytica, how to individuate radically or separate from the alienation of the other, and therefore also be able to return to a relation to the other at some other way, or a social in some other way. What would that look like? The virus as a sign. Burroughs, the writer, for example, often talked about how the word was a virus and developed methods of writing and speaking, actually even recording methods, early video and audio technology of how to cut through the word virus. And that's interesting because the actual cut, let's say, the Zen method, the Zen cut of a joke or a puzzle that scrambles your binary logic in the tradition of Zen Buddhism is similar to the method Lacan developed of a joke or humor or various ways of cutting through the hypnosis of the fantasy. And that also was something that was talked about by Burroughs and used not just in writing, but in audio and video recording. So I highly recommend all of those as ways of cutting through the word virus. The word virus as a panic is paralleling the virus, the biological virus right now. Which one is worse? How do they mirror each other? I'm not really sure. A couple of personal anecdotes. I've treated people medically for 20 years alongside of psychoanalytically. When I would treat people medically, I would be able to track groups of viral development on a kind of anecdotal level. I would see new types of symptoms emerge in a certain period, usually in the fall, and a slightly variation of an epidemic arise. And people talk about it in secondhand, and sometimes it has enough of a unique signature to be different from the average flu. And a good example of more of that was 2 years ago when I saw that happening, and much more intestinal symptoms than usual. And then there was some actual biological analysis and reportage of the fact that some variations of the polio virus were going around that hadn't gone around. But this didn't produce hysteria of polio returning, even though that year the number of flu and deaths rose dramatically, almost 100%. It didn't lead to that level because it was under the radar. People were able to recover from it. It's a slow-moving thing. Part of what's causing a dramatic reaction here: intensity and rapidity of contagion, intensity of symptoms. What's wrong with the symptoms? Okay, well, there's the uniqueness of losing your smell and taste. That's just a signature of the virus. They all have a different code. That makes it identifiable in a certain way. Does that happen with people with colds and flus? Sure, happens more in this case. Generally, though, it has the same symptoms as all epidemics do. And not just epidemics, allergies, colds, which come from mostly, go back to Chinese medicine, thousands of years old. All disease is an interaction between the external pathogen and the internal state of the subject. It's an encounter between self and other. and it has to be negotiated. Virile, which obviously is related to virus, virility could be seen as more important than health. Instead of containing and protecting yourself from everything, the ability to interact with pathogens or others or difference increases your virility, your ability to have things come in and out or go in and out of things and survive it. That would be a novel and intelligent approach that we could take to disease in general. And in fact, other cultures knew that. So that the intelligent form of homeopathic approach that existed thousands of years ago was bring people near to a certain disease at a certain time when they can take care of it so they don't get it later when it's more dangerous. Inoculation, smallpox, they used it for thousands of years ago. Homeopathy is a science of being able to produce virility by interacting with pathogens in a more healthy form. A vaccine is a more specific version of that, but has its own limited scope. It's only for a very particular code, whereas homeopathy is general and generic. Of course, there's not a total disuse for the vaccine when there is a certain dangerous code, but it's a myth to think you can create something that will solve something, especially when it's constantly mutating. So there's never going to be a substitute for general health that the body, also as many doctors have pointed out, vaccines are dangerous because they don't allow the general immune system to develop. If you simply inject the developing young body with dozens of toxins, even if it doesn't hurt them or produce chronic disease in them and deficiency, it may rob them of an encounter with some of these fairly harmless codes, viruses, etc., that maybe we need in order to develop to higher levels of virility. Again, it's not my argument. Many people have made this argument. What does it mean here? A virus mutated because of certain practices in the culture. Epidemics are social diseases. They're not random. Certain kinds of practices in certain cultures are going to produce a symptom which we better listen to, as I said in the quote. How do we listen to the virus? How do we listen to the information? How do we try to understand where it came from and the practices that developed that? How do we understand maybe what it has to tell us? Maybe that it's trying to help us in some way. Is it crazy to try to listen to these things? No, of course not. 99.999% of the population can listen to that, as well as the scientists, while we can still also be sane and protect ourselves from the dangers of contagion. Obviously, in the specific quarantining measures of Korea and China, they made more of an effort to find out where the spread was and to isolate the people in danger. Why are old people and people with compromised immune systems in danger? Because, like traditional Chinese medicine talks about, you're already in a compromised state. You can't handle this new information or this new trigger. So for those people, they need to really protect themselves from something like this. Does that mean that it's all going to be old people? Of course not. There's a whole spread of possibilities, but people are neglecting the idea that the state of mind someone's in, the state of health based on their behaviors, etc., even things they can't necessarily see in the obvious are going to affect their ability to recover. Again, to go back to traditional medicine, they talk about different constitutions and different organ systems of the body being stronger or weaker based on either what you're born with, your predisposition, and or what experiences you've already encountered. So you could be born with a lung deficiency, or you could be fine and develop a series of repeated encounters with pathogens that weaken your lungs so that you become more susceptible to bronchitis or asthma or something else. This person has a lung deficiency that is going to be seriously in trouble in trying to struggle with the code of this virus, which attacks the respiratory system deeply and intensively. Those are the people that are dying of it. And it is true that it's at a scary level, and we don't have the machines to make that emergency situation resolvable for everybody. It's not even resolvable. There's so many people that if they have that encounter, it's over no matter what. There's not even a clear understanding at this point of whether these respirators would be helping lots of people that can't be helped, or whether they're going to die no matter what anyway, and that's just keeping them alive for a longer period. There's no clear statistics on that yet. We'll have to see. but this idea that comes from traditional medicine of think of I mentioned this also to help people deal with their psychological anxiety about this, that it doesn't have to do with, you don't have to be completely paranoid or phobic. If you know something about your state of health, if you try to create preventive health before and now at this time, you don't have to feel helpless. As some people say, knowledge is empowering. I encourage you not just to look at stats, which are confusing and ultimately mean nothing for any given individual. Remember, no stats of any type can ever determine what happens with the singular case. That doesn't mean they're not useful. And they are useful for social actions, such as how people will move or travel or interact, but they are not in any way useful for the individual. The individual has to understand himself, where he's at in terms of these medical and psychological states, and how he's going to interact with this particular information. That's what's useful. So, well, it's getting later. I don't have much time. I'm going to present these ideas simply then, and perhaps provocatively for further elaboration, either later in the discussion or another time, which is what I talked about. How can one, given that there's this event, okay, I'm not going to talk about the virus as pandemic, biological, etc. There's so much that can be done at a level which I've spent so many decades trying to present out there, and I hope people will use this as an opportunity to learn more about medicine and disease in general for themselves and society. But what I want to focus on for a minute is how would the ethics, the psychoanalytic approach to existence work and benefit people in this new world, what the new world will be. What will the new world look like? It seems like it's going to be a reduction of socio-physical space. It seems that people are going to interact through information, virtually, through images and words. Obviously, you know, therefore, based on what I just said, how important it is to not be hypnotized. The idea of the face-to-face, handshakes, rituals, so many things of the past had that very purpose, so that people could know something more than just the signifier, the delusion, the manipulation. So this is even more important online, but it doesn't matter. It doesn't mean it's not something that we can do. I proposed that, okay, I'm proposing a radical overturning of psychoanalysis, as I have been for several years now. I've been proposing the dropping of the prefix psycho, since analysis after Freud was taken back into the psi professions in all of its problems that Freud tried to move away from, psychiatry, psychology, etc. Lacan was the one major figure who tried to wrench Freud's truth out of that morass and bring it back into what Freud envisioned and extend it even further scientifically based on what Freud was doing. I'm proposing to call it analysis, freeing it from that and freeing it also to be more of the lay practice that Freud and Lacan made it to be, which is open to everyone. So at Analytica, we do analytic training for everyone, whether it's someone who has no previous experience and wants to be an analyst in practice, which is a much better, more advanced training than an analytic institute in the institutional sense, or a university, or coaching. And why not? Why is coaching offering on a political economic level what Freud was trying to offer for psychoanalysis, a more advanced practice? Coaching doesn't have a more advanced practice. Freud abandoned education. Doesn't mean it's useful to educate and lead someone. It's not useful to hypnotize someone with therapy or hypnosis either. It's not useless to give someone a drug to treat them without them being a part of it. But all of those things were things that Freud left behind to move beyond. I was inspired by that and spent my life trying to do the same while also retaining the usefulness of therapies and medicines. They don't have to be thrown aside, and they don't and shouldn't be separated. Analysis shouldn't become some pure thing for the healthy or the bourgeois. It should be something that is a desiring practice, but at the same time, something that's more powerful and moves beyond medicine and psychiatry and therapy, as we know. So I'm trying to remain true to what I've learned from Freud and Lacan and extending analysis in its real sense. Part of that is what Freud dreamed of and couldn't imagine how it could exist, but what Lacan did spend his later years on, which is to develop a method of a collective that would answer to the other two impossible professions. So if psychoanalysis only has succeeded in a small way in transforming medicine into self-doctoring, then is it possible? Lacan gave some pointers to self-government and self-education. Yes, in his school he did, having studied that in depth with the people who were there. I'm trying to put it into practice, but also not in a doctrinaire way. I'm not interested in Lacanianism per se. That also is a church with its limitations. It is not useful. What's useful is to try to put into practice logically, practically, pragmatically, scientifically, these things that Lacan and Freud were doing, but that's not happening. So we try to do that at Analytica. Each person does analysis in their own way. Analysis is a way of learning to treat yourself by teaching another about your symptom. You teach yourself about your symptom, you transform yourself, you cure yourself. There can be a second phase. A person can go out and do what they want then with their practice, the practice of their desire, which their symptom has been transformed into. Or they can take another spiral around the path and teach themselves about the practice of analysis for and with another by teaching themselves about analysis through their own analysis, teaching someone else, i.e., as Lacan said, each analyst has to find his own way to practice. And this makes it a practice of diversity and individuation that retains a collective character. The small group of the cartel, the larger seminar, the school at large were methods Lacan developed for putting the analytic ethic and method and practice into practice in a way that would transform education and society and government. Has it ever happened? Of course not. There are small experiences of it that could be useful. Maybe this is a time when some of it can be useful. If, for example, some of us, including myself, can try to make it more clear and obvious and not be so wordy and burdened with references. However, otherwise it runs the risk of simply being guruism or just being the same thing again. So I try to find the balance between giving some respect to those I've learned from and find a way to innovate it on a pure scientific level. This is the place that we're at in doing that. So anyway, I'm trying to radically strip analysis down, at least in some areas for this. So I state that I would try to present principles for the new citizen. What principles for the new citizen? Sounds interesting. A new world, a new society, a new citizen. What could this possibly mean? Well, I propose the following, which I've discerned and distilled by observing certain cases, that a subject in the new society, and this would also be the model for, let's say, an analysand, where an analysand, all of us having been analysands, whether we practice or not, strives for. And of course, you can meditate on these and see where you can go with them. Principle 1 is be nice. Principle 2 is do what you want. Principle 3 is put your ideas into your work. Don't talk about them. Okay. Number 1, what can I say about that? Well, I'm not saying be kind. Kind means kind or like. It means be like everyone else. It's the oppression of the group mind again, whether it's a genetic group or a religious group, a cultural group. Nice actually comes from the root of the word ignorant. So I'm proposing a kind of ignorance of the analyst ethic, which is you don't know. Don't be mean. Don't assume the other. Don't assume you're right. I happen to be in the place of talking here right now, but that's me presenting what I love and believe in, that I've put a lot of hard work into trying to test and see if it works and means something. I have proof that it does, feedback from others. I'm always looking for more to refine it from others. But the more I'm doing that, if I'm free to do what I want, then it's easier to be nice, both in the sense of that we know of being nice to someone, but also to play ignorant. I don't need to know because I'm doing it the way I do it. And maybe that's useful to somebody else. They go together. The more you can be nice, the more you can do what you want. The more you do what you want, the easier it is to be nice. These seem like a pair to me. Okay, the third principle is very important. Don't talk about your work. You might think, well, you're contradicting it. You're talking about your work. No, I'm not. Because what I'm doing is I'm writing my work right now. To write means to operate in a certain way. I've sketched out a structure of ideas that I'm presenting with the floor to be heard by others. I'm giving you the position to listen to me and hear something and give me ideas about where I'm missing something if you wish, and to present your position. If your position is coming from your own desire, admittedly, like I'm saying mine does, and if you want to test it against reality. So what I mean by talk, you can write orally and you can speak in written language. To write is different than to talk, and talking is not useless. Talking is like free association. It's blah, 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 as Lacan said. It's the groundwork. Maybe something will come out of it, but eventually you have to test it by writing it. Writing it could be writing on paper. It could be writing as a lecture. It could be writing as a performance or a painting. To write, although writing with a pen is the ultimate form of writing, or the most obvious form. To write means to put it into a work. So that's what I'm saying. Put it into a work, some kind of work. All right, what's the example here? Well, David Lynch is a good example. He claims that he's happy in his life. He makes the most outrageous work that is provocative. People could see it as pornographic, as violent. He refuses to talk about his ideas. He will never give a meta commentary on it. And he won't talk to you about his ideas if you're hanging out with him. He's very nice. Everyone who works with him loves him. He talks about how angry he was when he was young and how bad his life was. He learned meditation, his own form of it. He invented his own form of meditation. That's part of the problem. You can't go and do meditation according to any yogi or guru or any book. You can start there and then make it your own. That's why it works for Lynch, because he's doing psychoanalysis, even though he didn't really do real psychoanalysis, maybe for good reason, because psychoanalysis as it exists in the public marketplace is not psychoanalysis. Maybe there's a good reason he avoided that, but he did it in his own way, and Lacan talks about this a lot. The artist as analyst in Joyce, in Klosowski, in Dali, as a model. This is a lot of where I'm drawing from and where Lacan went at the end of his life. Lynch seemed to be a good example in my times. And he puts it into his work, and that's it. And does what he wants. So is this a model for other people? Of course. You don't have to be an artist or a writer. Everything is your work. Put it into your work. Another way of saying this is that, okay, you could say that Freud's one great discovery is psychic reality. He noticed the fact that what people thought was reality is not reality, or is not the only reality. Let's see here, becoming invisible. There's a collective agreed upon social reality. There may be some real that we can't access, but a few scientists try to do that. But mostly people are driven by psychic reality. They're filtering in things through their delusion, their fantasy. That's step one. Accepting psychic reality as preeminent and predominant is the most important thing. Okay, so I'm going to parallel these three principles of the new citizen, the new subject, with three principles for the new analyst. Number one, if you're practicing as an analyst, that means someone has desired to put you in a position where they use you to learn something about themselves and to change something about themselves. Do this. Assume the contingent truth of that person, that subject, that analysan. This replaces listening. Listening is great. You have to have the art of listening. But the real ethic is first, assume the contingent truth. Or on a theoretical level, do the same thing as Freud said. Assume the contingent truth of something. This was demonstrated by mathematicians and physicists. There's no grounded reality. The hardest level physics and math has proven that the only thing that's necessary is contingency. Necessity of Contingency. It's a good book I recommend by a French philosopher. who does a nice proof that there is no necessity in the universe on any level, physical, scientific, etc. The only necessity is contingency. I differ from him. I think he paves the way, and that's a radical proposal that simply echoes smoothly what Cantor and quantum physics have already demonstrated, but is radically important for the everyday subject. No, the only necessity is not contingency. The necessity, as I call it, the necessity of contingency, with contingency highlighted, which is this philosopher's idea, leads immediately to the next step, which is the necessity of contingency, where necessity is highlighted. In other words, in the face of the discovery that there is no absolute, and instead of going crazy like Cantor or Nietzsche or so many others, which is something that happens when someone is faced with the idea that their truth, their symbolic reality, their other, their phallus, or even their fantasy, their object is non-existent, or that their fantasy is revealed to them after the idea of the symbolic reality not existing is revealed to them, that this creates the greatest problem. It is also necessary to traverse this abyss in order to get to somewhere else. Therefore, it happens to people. It falls upon people, no matter what. So it's a useful practice, analysis, as Lacan evolved it. It also is, and Freud already had a presentiment of this in Civilization and Its Discontents. This isn't just a better form of therapy, Freud said. This is actually answering to the bigger problem. In other words, if we solve all the little problems, the little symptoms of epidemics, which we had solved for the most part, but perhaps we're behaving socially in a way because of not solving the next problem after the social epidemic, and so it's coming back again. If we actually solve all these problems, the same with an individual. Do we want to create a new problem all the time? Do we want to create a new problem to grapple with, or do we want to deal with the next more difficult problem? Civilization and Its Discontents. Alienation, nihilism, suicidality emerge with the most advanced subjects, individually and socially, societies. That's already known statistically, scientifically. What's the answer to that? Freud thought that psychoanalysis might have somewhat of an answer to that. Lacan had more of an understanding of that. This is what we're talking about today, trying to accept that the necessity of contingency leads to the necessity of contingency. In other words, each subject must find a truth for themselves, something to live by, a constructability. So it's not just a politics of freedom that one frees oneself from the group mind or the master or the big other. It's actually a necessity to move forward individually or socially, that we're able to take part in constructing something. This relates to what I was saying, the third part of the principle of the new citizen. You have to put your psychic reality into a work, make it transmissible or useful to others. You can't do that if you don't take it seriously in the first place, which means do what you want. And that's not going to work if you're always not being nice. That is, assuming you know what's going on and telling everybody by going along with the mainstream, or doing the opposite, revolting against everything, hysterically rebelling. You have to believe in your fantasy, take it as a delusion, and then make it work, construct it into something, prove it in some way, and make it work. So the analytic principles that follow these principles of the new citizen are not just assume the contingent truth of the position of the subject you're working with, the analysan, the patient, etc. If I work with a medical patient, I still treat them analytically. I assume the contingent truth of whatever they're bringing to me as the bigger picture, the symptom that surrounds everything. That doesn't mean there's not one or more medical symptoms within that also have something that is real, in the real about them, that could be approached by a treatment that I could give them. But I don't want to only look there, and I don't want to be like the psychoanalyst who doesn't look there and ignores it or just gives it to the technician of the physician. I want to bridge that gap. I want to be able to use pragmatically practicing methods of playing around with our symptoms and our impasses in the purpose of understanding the bigger picture of our impasse and freeing that to go somewhere. So the second principle of the new analyst is speak from the position of your desire, which of course originates in Lacan's idea of the desire of the analyst. That is, that the analyst is able to practice in the position of listening or assuming the contingent truth of the analysan. It's only because he's had the grace to be in that position that someone allowed him to be in himself, and realize that he still has a contingent position. As Lacan said, when I'm speaking in a seminar, I'm in the position of the analysan. I must never stop knowing what it means to occupy that I'm speaking from my desire, and that's all that holds it together, except to the degree that I try to transmit it and test it out in the real or in the social. So the analyst then, this makes analysis more of a co-creation. This doesn't mean it's intersubjective, that's something different. What it means is that the analysan constructs their delusion, their psychic reality, in facilitation by the position of the analyst, who also continues to remember that he's speaking from his position and knows what it is better because of having worked on it and continuing to work on it himself. And that back and forth produces a certain laboratory, a certain collective space of two, which can then eventually be expanded to 3, 4, 5 in small groups, where many can operate in this back and forth collective analytic discourse and method, and it can keep expanding. The third principle, therefore, is what? Facilitate the construction of a work. Okay, it's the same thing. The position, the place of the analyst helps to facilitate the construction of the work on the part of the subject or the analysan or the patient. Any doctor can play this position too. Of course, when someone's dying because they can't breathe, you first have to, if you have the ability, if you have some intense technology, to keep them alive when they never would have been alive in the past, which is something that people also are questioning. Should they even be alive? Is it right to go to extraordinary measures? Were they supposed to die individually or spiritually or socially at this point? At least we have to bridge that question that some people are doing. Doesn't mean to be callous. It means that we have to look at all of these pictures. Even if we do say, no, it's fine. We have the power to produce all this technology for emergencies, to help people and to extend their lives. We should also be saying, okay, at what cost? What's the balance? For what purpose? So they can live like a vegetable, or so they can continue to find desire in their life for themselves, meaning, or to share that meaning with others in a collective. All these questions have to be asked. There's no way not to ask these questions in order to move forward. Otherwise, we just slip back, continue to slip back into the same thing again. We should be asking these questions. I think we are asking these questions. In this experience, whatever's going on in these weeks, it's miraculous how inspired people are. At least in my experience, so much hope and inspiration and excitement about the future. It reminds me of events like 9/11 or a blackout in New York. Before things happen, phobically, paranoically, people have always this fear of the worst. But in the few cases where in our comfortable society a crisis does happen, in my experience, humans have responded amazingly. Why can't we acknowledge this? Why can't we talk about utopias rather than dystopias? Why is there one utopian book or theory or a film made for every 100 dystopias? I'm not sure. Psychically, socially, that's an issue or a symptom. So here's the idea. Be nice, do what you want, put your ideas into a work rather than talking about them. Orality only goes so far. As a practitioner, assume the contingent truth of your subject, understand what psychic reality is and how predominant it is. Always speak from the position of your own desire, and continue to do what you have to do to remember that, and help to facilitate the construction of a work, which ultimately means, although this person is in a special position different from you that you were once in, you're also not that different. You're co-constructing something together. So I hope that even when I'm speaking in this, I'm speaking with information, with knowledge, with construction, not to tell you this is the truth, but to hope to inspire you to trigger things unconsciously of your own that relate to your own life, ones that are passionate, ones that you agree with me, ones that you disagree with me, to find some combination of all of that. And so I guess I'm going to make an attempt now to open up the dialogue, at least orally, and see where that goes. Well, first I'm going to look through some of the comments and see if there's anything that needs to be answered. Mostly questions, responses about the information, where to go, what to do. So it seems like most people would prefer to ask the questions in person, or maybe they're just taking it in and they want to talk about it later, which of course I welcome any comments. Let's see here. Let's see. I like it. What about the violence of the pandemic and economic collapse? That's a good question. We'll have to see what happens in the aftermath. Why now? Why this? Why is it this thing which triggered hysteria and phobia? I'm actually interested. I try to figure out myself. Is this phobia? Is this hysteria? Is it paranoia? It's at least all three of those. I've seen all three of those emerge as strategies of dealing with this. Let's see. Yeah, ephemeral version of virus. I did want to mention that, again, about this virus existing between, in this place between a sign and a signifier, meaning a sign is a piece of code. There's a code. It doesn't have an animal existence. It has to inhabit something else, like a writing, a PR advertisement meme that gets passed on quickly through the social media of human beings that want to belong to the group by passing on this virus and sharing it. But also that the virus has to do with susceptibility. The thing about the virus is that it relates to suggestion. So, for example, to try to make clear that something that people don't understand, hepatitis, as a case ago, hepatitis means hepato, liver, itis, inflammation. It simply means inflammation of the liver. It's a symptom. It's not a disease. An individual can drink a lot and have hepatitis the next week, or they can continue drinking and produce chronic hepatitis in themselves. Never contagious, not a virus. Is it a disease? It's a self-induced symptom. Maybe it's a syndrome or a disease because they couldn't stop themselves from making it happen in themselves. Now here's where it gets tricky. Once you've created this work of art, hepatitis, once you've constructed a hepatic liver, you now have an artwork, a machine, a factory for producing the information of hepatitis. So in this case, it becomes a contagious information or virus that can then, someone else can be susceptible to. So it was both a symptom that was just created endogenously and then became a disease of the way we think of diseases, but it's just viral information. Here's where it gets tricky again. It's not universal. No virus is universal. It's less universal than people think, even though it's one of the more universal diseases. The person that is likely to have no symptoms versus have symptoms, it depends on their state, not just general state of health, but their resonance. Like I said, before I mentioned lung deficiency as being dangerously susceptible to not being able to overcome the information of this coronavirus. In this case, having an excessive or inflammatory liver constitution, which is a type that you can be born with, and or a type that you can produce through your actions, like drinking or being angry all the time, you become susceptible, suggestible to the information of the encounter of a hepatitis patient. So the person that already has that mental, physical situation, where do we draw the line between the mind and body here, is susceptible to having an overreaction to the hepatitis. But even at this point, it's not the disease or not the disease. It has to do with virility. It has to do with how they handle the information. This is how we need to be thinking about diseases and viruses. We're encountering viruses all the time. When there's one like this that stumps us and blows our mind, it's serious. That gives us the chance to actually think through this on a bigger level. What happens when this person encounters it? If they already have proto-hepatitis, inflamed liver, and they come in contact with more of that information, they're going to mount a big struggle and or maybe not being able to overcome it. It's too late. If they don't have that, if it's not one of their problems, if their liver is fine, nothing happens. Then we get into this idea of the test. Okay, there are tests to test. What are they testing? Not that you have the disease, but that you've had an interaction with the information. So there's people that test positive. Yes, I've had an interaction with hepatitis information, but no, I'm completely fine and healthy now. In fact, I'm more healthy because I know how to interact with that hepatitis information and not be taken down by it. Same with the coronavirus or anything else. Virility, how to interact. So to go back to the stats again, they're unclear, but so far, at least what I've seen in some stats, is that 50% of people that interact with the corona information don't even get symptoms. That means they're already immune to it. They've encountered it. They're virile against it. Then of the remaining 50%, and these are people that actually tested positive, so they know they had an interaction with it, but never got any symptoms. That's health. That's health, at least on this level. They could have a liver or a heart situation that makes them very unhealthy and susceptible to death from another virus or another psychological stressor or something else. Of the remaining 50%, not the remaining, 50% no symptoms, 40% mild symptoms. That means they encountered, they struggled, they overcame it. Now they're more virile against coronaviruses in general. That's positive. 7% of the population comes in contact with it, has severe symptoms. Well, even this isn't that big of a deal. I'm sure everybody in the last 10 years has had some really bad flu where they were at home for a week or 2 weeks, extremely fatigued, couldn't get out of bed, severe bronchitis, maybe even temporary asthma. That's what happens. Only in like 2 or 3% of the situation do people become life-threatened. And of course, those are people with lung immunity deficiency issues, almost 99.99% of them being old, which of course happens. Everything burns out as we get old. The lungs more than ever. The respiratory lung system is how a majority of old people end up dying, even if they had a different condition. Their lungs are weakened because of that. And because we have to breathe every second, it's one of the more tricky situations. It's either now, for a few seconds, for a few minutes, if it can't happen, you're gone. That's not the case in other situations. That's why it's dangerous. That's why that's happening. All right, so then there's 1%, or some people say a lot less. The statistics have shown different variations depending on different populations, less than 1%, more than 1%, a few percent deaths. These all, when you get to the smaller numbers, it has to do even more with the factors of what's available to keep them alive. Where are the respirators, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm just trying to use that to go over this example of susceptibility of a state of a person's physical and psychological body at this point, how they're susceptible to a certain disease. So we all have the capability of this. We all have the capability of preventively learning and developing our particular mind and body states and organs to be healthy against this. Of course, we're going to die of something and we're going to get sick, and that's normal too, to overcome diseases and to struggle through them. So that's all part of the game. It's unavoidable. All right, where was I? I guess I was perusing some of these comments before. Opening up, let's see here. All right, well, I guess I talked a little bit longer than usual, which often happens. I mean, longer than I expected, at least. I am going to try to use the technology now to, okay, so I guess how this works is if someone has a question or a comment, they can raise their hand. Somewhere on your device, there's a raise hand, and then it'll pop up on here. Okay, and then I have to choose people, and it's not telling me which ones came first, so I can't be perfect in terms of that, but I'm just going to try to see where it takes me. So, okay, someone raise their hand. I'm going to try to enable their audio, and I believe you have to enable your audio too. Let's see if it works. Malik, is that right?
Yeah, that's right.
Okay. I think when you talk, you show up to other people anyway. So anybody who wants to talk makes themselves known to the group. So I'll assume that once you've done that, it's okay. You can use your name, whatever. What's your comment or question?
My comment is that transitions tend to put people into what I call a liminal state, or what people who study ritual call liminal states. And so to me, it seems like the coronavirus is putting us all into a big shared ritual. And I was wondering if you might talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, I like that idea. It's very positive. Yeah, we could run with that. I mean, while not dismissing the dangers and deaths and sorrows that would upset people, we could also embrace that idea that maybe this is one of the messages, the unconscious messages of the virus to society. The importance of bringing back ritual and the sacred in a world that's too profane, to use those terms of the anthropologists, that we, and it works sort of unconsciously, or even just like practically it makes sense, because our production and consumption, our busyness has gotten so out of control exponentially just in the times I've been conscious, 30 years, that how much more can we handle? And then if a society is so busy, so cutting corners, cuts corners, that even with all their knowledge to be clean and hygienic and not create viruses, ends up doing it because they're too busy, too overworked, then this restores us to the necessity of rest. So yeah, even on a simple level, we could look at a major epidemic to the society as, look, you're already sick in a lot of ways. This is triggering, this is a pathogen and you got to struggle with it, but it's also dumping and unloading all your other toxins, your withdrawal from all this stuff, your panic. That's the same way I look at individual disease, that, people think they're really healthy, holistic people, yoga, exercise, whatever, still get sick and they don't understand it. Like, there's no way in the universe today that you don't psychically and physically pick up all kinds of toxins when something happens, whether it's a psychological stress event or a cold or a flu triggers it. You're also giving a chance for your body and mind to dump lots of toxins. I'm putting in a little bit of a negative slant. So going back to yours, yeah, the positive slant of that is the joy that comes out of it. Like I'm saying, I'm having withdrawal experiences. I'll have like a memory. I'm like, oh yeah, I really feel like going down to that one restaurant, or I haven't seen that person in a long time. But then I suddenly remember, oh, I can't do that right now. But actually that was cool because it reminded me something I forgot to do and want to do. It increased desire because I was forced into asceticism. I couldn't do it all the time, so I want to do it more now. And I think what's missing right now is that we're withdrawing from a lot of the unnecessary addiction to information, to whatever, like clubs, restaurants, retail products, etc. And I find people like that hurts them for a minute, and then they're happy about it. They're like, well, I don't really need that, and I see how I don't need it, and I'm not spending that money, and I have time to do things with myself and with other people that I would like better. The one thing they're missing is not getting, the most important, and where I think we could go in the aftermath, is to accentuate the social, to be able to spend time, the sacred, ritual, whatever, eros, romance, increase that without the need for the media, the mediated part of it. I hope that is one of the biggest takeaways of all this, which I guess I'll say is part of psychoanalysis too, in the sense that analysis is a practice of intimacy, maybe the best practice of intimacy, if it's not constrained by its orthodoxy. It's basically a practice of intimacy. And we could be practicing intimacy, being like individually, collectively, on all levels, about actually speaking, sharing with each other, creating, constructing in so many ways. So I hope this big shared group ritual, which is cool, also could lead to an infinite amount of small groups of being able to find ritual and all of that.
We all seem to be it has a synchronizing effect. Like usually we don't go on retreat all at the same time, but in this situation, we're all on retreat all at the same time. And so when we go walking in the street in our neighborhood, we see other people and we're all kind of living the same thing. Whereas we used to all live our separate lives with our own separate stories. Now we have a large shared story, and it's across the globe.
I like that, because you're sort of challenging my fundamental desires or symptoms, which is I ultimately err on the side of pursuing separation, individuation, suspicious of the group in so many ways. So maybe you're pointing out something that I was saying that I was hoping for on the other side, which is a way to refine the resonance and the collective on the other side of separation, that we don't just go to like, again, sharing the same news online, but we find ourselves sharing the same experience, each in a different way, of how we're hiking, taking a walk, taking a drive, at least until hopefully these things also aren't taken away from us. That at that point, I guess we'll be simply sharing digitally, like we're doing today, some kind of resonance of what we're doing alone in our homes. So yeah, I like that idea of the resonance part.
I sort of harken back to the work of Claire Graves and Don Beck with their spiral dynamics. I think that's a good mix where your desire for separation is a kind of separation that allows us to look at the whole, the multiple systems that exist in the world and be able to separate enough to be able to help the systems sort of unravel and become their greatest self. And so I think there's a mix where we can separate ourselves from the collective in order to help the collective.
Yeah, absolutely. You're referring to integral theory and evolution. This is what we're talking about. What would be the next phase of finding resonance in the collective of individuation? And maybe that's where we could take this. Say, like, this unfortunate event has forced us into this thing. Can we mourn the losses and start to look at what it's teaching us about where we can go from there? I'm inviting other people to raise their hand too if they want to say something.
Sure.
I'm happy to keep talking, but never had such a big group be so quiet. If you don't, maybe you want the videos. No. Anybody who has a comment, a thought? Yes. Okay. Cool. Okay. Yes. Chapkin, I believe you have to unmute yourself too.
Yeah. Hi, Scott. How are you doing?
Good. How are you?
That's coming through.
Yeah.
Great. I guess my question and thoughts and what you think about this, that as a process of evolution, I think perhaps this virus, like a lot of different viruses, as I mentioned before in my question to you before about ephemeral versions of viruses, is how this affects us on an evolutionary scale, because as Malik mentioned, we do see the positives, but I'm not sure that everybody sees the positives. I think there's a small percentage of the human race that sees this as a positive, and there's a larger version of the human race that have too much to deal with on an everyday level, especially now with isolation and restriction.
Right.
Wives and mothers at home are now dealing not only with children, but the loss of their work. They're dealing with the negatives of this virus, and seeing the positives, I think in some ways will take a lot of effort and probably won't come naturally because of the intensity that they're dealing with at the moment, which in itself is a virus. It's like a vortex, which is probably very difficult to escape, considering that you may have a husband or a partner that is having difficulty themselves. So for a husband or a wife, they're dealing with trying to support that, but supporting themselves, supporting their children, supporting the fear in the household.
Right.
For us who are lucky enough to be isolated by ourselves or with very like-minded people, or have the ability to communicate that, I think that works great. But for the majority of the world, I think there's a different feeling. Can you comment on that?
Sure. And simultaneously, someone had just written a comment about class consciousness, which I think you're speaking to. My first response to that is, yeah, I referenced it, but I keep forgetting. Well, I said in the positive sense that I felt like friends, colleagues, patients, students, and Alazans had a similar resonance in my experience, which I know is like, it's a selective group. It's a selective group because I know we resonate with each other and we're working towards something. And I think that we're working towards the positive and involving that. So we should push that as much as we can. To the degree that we're part of that, we should be devoting ourselves to helping people in whatever way we can, lead them in that direction. I also know that experience is, as you're reminding us, that we're already a kind of minority or selective group. So how would I want to hear from the rest of the people. In other words, what I don't hear outside of this positive aspect of some of us who may have the ability to handle it better intellectually, financially, etc., is in terms of the rest, or if you assume that's the majority or the mass, where are their words? I don't hear their words. The words I hear are from whoever is controlling the media and talking about it to sensationalize things. They're not those people. They're the ones spinning the narratives, all of them. Where do we hear from those people? And when we do, are they talking about the viral fears, which isn't the real issue? Because only a tiny percentage of those who actually are susceptible to the dangers of death in this, that matters to. And as far as I've seen, those people are all protecting themselves highly. Where are the comments about that? Where are those supposed people not talking about the financial devastation of this? Because if they were, and they are the majority, why would they not have already overturned the decisions that are being made about sacrificing the financial, real material goods for the biological pandemic for the few who are in danger? In other words, the decisions that are being made and all the narratives spun through government and media is towards, oh my God, we have to save those few people who might die, which, as we know statistically, is going to be far less than 1% of the population. It's going to be minuscule and probably less than every year's flus. What about how much financial, psychological, real devastation? How many deaths from illness, suicide, etc., will come from the choices that are being made about this? That's my response to how I include class consciousness into it. I haven't heard anyone speak up for balancing the question of these real repercussions because of the choices that are being made, except Trump, who's only being attacked for it. It's only being used against him that he even brings these questions up. So much so that I've never actually seen him cave on his own principles in the history of his presidency to this degree. That's how powerful this narrative is. He's the only. What about the class consciousness of those who are actually in danger of being hurt by this on a real material level? Where are they speaking about it? Do you think?
Yep.
I'd love to see
that. I don't know, but I think that's a question for anybody that's listening, because everybody has someone that has been affected by this virus, either positively or negatively. And some people, they want to understand that it's good, there is good to come. Some people really believe that this is just the worst thing that's ever happened, and they are totally buying into the reality that is being sold to them. And granted, a lot of these people are fearful for their families, their children, their lifestyles, and a lot of the distractions that have led them to believe that this is what their life is, which ultimately won't be around as a result, because we're in a changing world.
Absolutely.
My cousin contracted coronavirus in Paris. She's doing okay, but the reality is that it's effective. She's a psychologist in Paris, so she has a fairly decent understanding, but she also suffers from another ailment, which puts her in the susceptible range. So she's also in the fear category, but working as hard as she can to help other people. So I guess my question to you, Scott, is how do we inspire and help the people that most need it from a layman's perspective? I know for my part, I call people that I think may be lonely, may be having difficulty, and I just reach out, because at the moment I'm living with my mother because she needed me here in Australia, which puts me 14,000 kilometers away from my own family. And
what time is it there?
It's 12:30 in the daytime.
The next day.
The next day. So
right.
Yeah, ahead by a little bit. That's just a principle.
Yeah.
And so, you know, I'm dealing with the realities that my family isn't with me, or I'm not with my family. So,
right.
And I'm with my mum. So there's a whole, you know, so I guess my question is how do we inspire? How do we help the people that actually do need the help?
Good question. I have several thoughts about that. One is, first of all, it reminds me of a friend and colleague stressing through his work the inevitabilities of dieback, so to speak, that like the forest is going to burn every once in a while. It's built in and it regenerates it. So you can't, and then man comes and he creates forest fires problematically that are symptomatic. But then the do-gooding doctors try to stop all the forest fires, but they go too far because they won't even allow the proper dieback to take place, and has to happen somewhere. Okay, once we have control over everything, like you said, we're also in control of our lives that never happened before. Where and how do we make the decisions, or where do we let go? And well, I guess we help people by inspiring them to do as much, to fight, to transform, to shift, while at the same time reminding them to let go. And let go, be helpless, deal with the consequences of things happening, which sometimes have to do with your own choices. See if there's any of that there. And sometimes even more tragically, don't have to do with your own choices, but come from someone else's or nowhere. That's like the ultimate hard thing to face up to, just a pure tragedy and letting go. So I guess I'm talking about, there's two things you can do for people. One is to encourage and inspire them with ideas for the possibilities and the best in our lives and in their life. The other is to kind of be like in a hospice, to sit with them, to be in the sacred of the tragedy, whether it's just someone who's tortured by the illness for days or weeks, which again, I think we've all been there, and or that they're doing the same thing, but it's going to lead to death. So that has to do with a kind of like being a priest or being in hospice and being able to share that. There's no reason why we couldn't take some of both of that and bring it together to be inspiring and or bear witness to people's tragedy and torment at the same time. I guess it's a tall order, but it seems like people are doing somewhat of a job right now doing that in some way, I hope. Or, okay, it reminds me of Georges Bataille, the French philosopher who I love, who was actually the one who invented this concept of the sacred and the profane and how we were out of balance decades ago. Talking about, it slipped my mind for whatever reason I was going to say. This kind of acceptance of the end, this acceptance of, oh, I know what it was. Shared anguish turns it into glory. Anguish experienced in isolation is torment, but to share it, to have someone bear witness to it, to express or communicate it, turns that angst or that anguish into a kind of ecstasy, or it can. At least that seemed to be a practice for him, that the ability to open up and share an anguish together. Maybe this speaks to what the other person was just saying, Malik, the idea of a resonance, a shared ritual is a sharing of anguish that in itself could help to transform any isolated person's anguish. And maybe their isolation in this anguish, whether it's with the symptoms of the virus or just the anxiety or panic of the experience is maybe they were already experiencing as much or more of that isolated anguish in other ways. So maybe this is a kind of forcing open of the isolated anguish that could allow us to share an experience. So I'm encouraging the more of this, the better in any way. Call up your friends, call up people that you haven't talked to in a long time. Offer what you can, not on a practical level, although that's okay too, but mostly on a psychoanalytic level, just being present, just listening and being present. I mean, what do we have? We have too much time on our hands, so we could be offering and sharing this so much. Any other thoughts, questions? Not that I'm interrupting. You can speak again. I'm just telling other people.
No.
If anybody wants to raise their hands, go ahead and do it. You don't have to wait. Just put your hands up anytime. Right. I'll get to them in whatever order. So feel free.
Okay, so I'm gonna lower my hand, Scott, in a minute.
Okay.
But I'd like to leave the group just with a thought as I've been listening. Firstly, I want to say thanks, Scott, for creating this group. And secondly, as I was listening, to be very transparent about my own feelings, and I wonder if this is felt by the rest of the group in some way. There's a point where I start to think that what I have to say isn't actually that important, because, well, for my part, you know, I haven't read all the books you've read. I've led a life of great experience and had a great family interests, if you want, that have led me to where I am. But I wonder if anybody out there is thinking that what they have to say isn't important or helps the conversation, or they just feel like it's just not something they want to talk about, but primarily based on a fear of not being, fear of talking to a group, so to speak. So I had to trespass that fear and realize that, in fact, I did have something to say. No matter how important, unimportant it was, there was some things that were very important in regards to what's going on in the world, which I believe I expressed and you've answered to. I believe that other people in the group have that same feeling, and I personally would love to hear from them, no matter what the question is, because I think that part of this conversation is actually transgressing our own fears as a individual and as a group. And I think that energy, in fact, is what overcomes a lot of what we're feeling, essentially. Or maybe, Scott, I can leave you with that.
Sure.
Because I really believe that, you know, all creatures, great and small.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So I'm going to lower my hand now and then basically stop talking.
Great.
Thanks so much, Scott.
Sure. I only makes me think of that's another place we have to go to that it's hard to describe, which is after we've individuated from the group, and maybe we needed the self or the ego to separate from the group, then the self or the ego becomes the next impasse. And how do we let go of that? The new collective wouldn't be a mass mind. It would be after the individuated. And that would be as I describe it, or as I've thought of it, then each moment of one's self or one's relation to the other or others would become the principle. So that there would be a moment of enactment, that I myself no longer have to be subscribed to the identity of myself or the collective superego of who I'm supposed to be, that I could be a different person or free to enact some different being at different moments. And then that could also happen with an assemblage of people that weren't a collection of egos, but was a certain momentary assemblage. I try to achieve that, and yet I'm also resistant to my own desires to achieve that, because I know that my own desire to make that presence happen puts my presence too much sometimes into the group. So all I can say is that I hope for people to speak out, speak against me, participate in it. I also try to make collective events, which are also challenging, because when you just try to make a collective event, it often descends into chaos. So somehow we try to find that balance between the collective again and the individuated. I guess seems like the next person was Emily, if you're still there.
Hi, I'm actually not Emily. I've co-opted I've co-opted my wonderful partner Emily's laptop. She's sitting next to me.
Cool.
It's been a captivating discussion, but yeah, something that that rose to mind like a few minutes ago when we were talking about kind of like dystopia and utopia. Just an interesting thought that crossed my mind is that like maybe that dystopia is actually utopia, and that like mediocre survival, the day-to-day is actually like dystopia. And that like in moments of challenge and like anguish and intensity and, you know, like a breakdown of the everyday and like what we are, you know, maybe possibly a lot of the world is experiencing as like a dystopia is actually like a moment of utopia.
I hear you, and I'm going to say yes and no.
Sure, of course.
To that is that, again, I'm thinking of Bataille again. On one place, he says that even though we, as human subjects, we seek the sacred with all our desire, we also resist it because the sacred is not safe. It doesn't preserve ego boundaries. It doesn't preserve bank accounts. It's unknown, uncertain, risky. We seek it, and yet we're afraid of it. So we often will resist it, and we will resist it, and it will befall us in a sense. So he would say, socially, we need to be incorporating some kind of scrambling into society so it doesn't become too profane. Otherwise, we're going to break out into a war. So a war is a symptom of a profane society that doesn't have a place of the sacred and uncertainty. Just like a disease is a symptom of an individual who doesn't already have a way of incorporating the unknown or uncertain. In that sense, I think you're right, that the war or the disease gives us a taste of the sacred. But I also think that that's pathological. It's better than nothing, but it's not really the ultimate way we could experience it. And I agree with Bataille that we could introduce and incorporate versions of uncertainty, risk, chaos, the sacred, whatever you want to call it, into our society and our individual lives ahead of time so that it didn't have to happen in the form of a war or a pandemic. I think we could do that. We could figure out ways to do that. And I mean, Lacan, this is where he was going psychoanalytically as well. When he talks about at the end of his life, what he's interested in his patients is what he calls the practice of jouissance, the practice of enjoyment. How is it that you enjoy? How is it you're incorporating a sacred or a drive beyond the safe and the subscribed that reaches a level of enjoyment or ecstasy that is enough to satisfy you on that level, so that you won't just stagnate in the profane, in the dystopia of safe everyday life.
Yeah, one of the previous commenters, I guess, talked about how like there's this, you know, everybody's like walking around in the streets together. That we're all kind of like sharing this as like in a weird like disjointed collective way, and it seems like that's it. I think, and you responded that it's like sort of like a ritualistic behavior that we're all like kind of collectively engaging in. And that to me is like kind of one of the like maybe like utopian like aspects or like seeds to this, is that like we're suddenly like collectively plunged into this like unexpected and unpredictable like kind of like ritualized behavior. And that's like sort of my takeaway on the like what aspects of this like, you know, objectively like kind of terrible event, like there's like a facet to it that, you know, is kind of like moving us into at least in this moment, sort of this like funny like collective ritual. Anyway, thanks for a lot of your thoughts. It's been a
Yes,
fun.
thank you.
Absolutely. I just realized when you're saying that I put a paper on the back to draw on, which I do in most of my talks or seminars, but forgot to, or wasn't even drawn to. I guess already like this sort of intimacy of this experience in this event is making me feel different than like, not that demonstrating things diagrammatically is useful, but it's transmitting information on another level. And even though this medium is more alienating than usual in that if it's been a big group of like 60 to 100 people through virtual, there's also something intimate about it, that we're all sheltered at home and sharing a kind of intimacy, a non-obscene intimacy, a non-extroverted, non-public intimacy. So I think it is possible that there could be some great intimacy shared by virtual means, although it certainly has probably more dangers than good. So I think it has to be worked with or struggled with. Also at the same time, what you made me think of, I was Bataille again. At the end of his life, was talking about wanting, he was seeking what he called like a merging of the sacred in everyday life, because he saw that the sacred erupted symptomatically in the negative, like a war or a disease, or as he described, it was built in for almost all previous civilizations. They knew how to build the sacred into their society in the form of a festival. Okay, 5 days, people can do whatever they want, party, get wasted, kill each other, or human sacrifice, or whatever. And then he saw that, and it was like a revelation to him that other societies had like rituals of the sacred and the profane to keep better balance, and that we were out of balance with just the profane. Everything always had to be really more productive, more rational. So, but then he said, well, that's an impasse because we're individuated society. We're not a collective. So we can't use festivals or human sacrifices. Or perhaps for him, even like a group resonance wouldn't be the answer. The answer would be, for him would be like, it was eros, poetry, eroticism, meditation, psychoanalysis, art, other forms of the sacred. Not that the collective version isn't okay too, and maybe it is necessary. But then I think if I was following Bataille, now it'd be like, Bataille as my doctor, my analyst is telling me that I'm still in a stage of denial. The first stage would be panic. The second stage would be denial. Oh, everything's going to go back to what it was. The third stage would be elation. Oh, this is going to be even better. I'm going to solve the problem. I'm going to make everything better. The final stage, I think, would be a kind of letting go without giving up hope. It would be a sort of, actually, I don't know what's going to happen. Everything is fine in the moment. I'm thinking, I'm reading, I'm talking to people, I'm seeing, I'm doing something, and it doesn't matter what I'm doing. Whatever I'm doing moment by moment, I'm so immersed in that moment. I'm trying to extract the immersion in that moment. And maybe the virus will teach us something if it tells us by means of our politicians, you are going to sit the fuck down and wait it out until you get this message. As long as you're fighting it on any level, it's not over yet. So
yeah, I don't have any much more to say. I guess I could put my hand down.
okay.
But yeah, it's the only other thing that like I wrote down as a note like along, all right, I think earlier was just this notion of like and this is connected much more to an earlier discussion, but like a cytokine storm as like an overreaction of the human immune system to a virus, and then like our like social response that has like, you know, ground our economy to a halt. Like that there's like an interesting parallel there. And I don't really have much more to like say on it, that there's just like an interesting parallel that like we're behaving collectively as a society in a certain way from an economic perspective, in much the way that the immune system does when it like doesn't really know how to like, you know, mount an antibody oriented response to a virus.
True.
Interesting parallel. I don't know if there's much to say about it, but I'd be interested if you do have things to say about it.
No, I agree with you. I mean, I probably said stuff about that already. I guess I'll try to take another question rather than talk more. Let's see here. Anatoly, is that right? Are you there? If you raise your hand, I think you need to unmute your mic. Wait, did I? Okay, wait.
Oh, you unmuted me, sorry.
Okay, let's see here. Getting taken down by the technology. Huh, it's weird, it's not working. I think there was a glitch somehow. If there's someone else that wants or wanted to speak, please raise your hand now, because all the other hands have been erased. Okay. Anatole?
Is that working?
Yeah.
Hey, how are you?
Good. How are you?
Just wanted to introduce something that's not my idea, but is a fact of life as I understand it in the world of viruses, which is that the human genome seems to be full of the historical remnants of fragments of viral information from the ages. And it strikes me that part of the group transformation that's occurring right now is not only one of having this encounter with new information, but that information may be becoming concretized in a way that a lot of experience doesn't become. You know, I have my life history of experiences that may take the form of me having written them down or be able to tell a story, etc. But there isn't necessarily a physical manifestation of this. And if we become exposed en masse as a species to this new information to the point that it incorporates itself in us, for me, it begins to resemble something more of an initiation in a culture in which everybody might receive the same tattoo or the same mark. And and I do see how in culture, in Western culture, where the tattoo was at one time considered something of a counterculture element, that's become more mainstream. I think it's part of a thrust towards trying to concretize some of the things that may only otherwise exist sort of in our mind or in stories. And so that we may all carry something that isn't even our choice, but is somehow a mark of what it was to be alive or present or having an encounter during this time, something more tribal than the things that, being a Gen Xer, I maybe strived for much of my life to contrive, but is now being foisted upon me in its own form.
Yeah, that made me think of the old polio vaccine marks that were left on a certain generation, literally as a kind of viral tattoo, in a weird way. Well, first I just want to point out that I get your similarity, except I'm not sure if the tattoo is a good example, because although the tattoo has become a fad that a lot of people like, rather than a radical event, every tattoo is an individuated choice that someone makes, whereas this is a kind of like a mark that, in the old tribal sense, the degree to which a tribe would force a mark on someone as a rite of passage to be in the tribe is closer to what's going on here, where nature or God or whatever you want to call it marks humans if they want to continue to go through. But really exciting that you brought that up about the sort of the the internal tiny mark of the genetic code, and it reminds me of two things, psychiatrically, psychoanalytically, that Freud believed in phylogenesis, which is another of the bridging of the social and the biological, and that he believed that acquired characteristics in society could be encoded into the genome and passed on. And there's plenty of evidence for that, even though it's still not the mainstream belief. It's also what Hahnemann, the great physician and inventor of homeopathy, proved and showed in many ways, proved basically that certain diseases that were acquired and not accommodated for, like I just said, like a disease that's not conquered and absorbed by an individual, can remain a symptom throughout their life, and then can even be passed on to their child. So it's anti-strict Darwinianism. In fact, phylogenesis says something more like that there's acquired characteristics that get encoded in individuals and genetically passed on through family strains, as well as large collectives, the whole population or whole groups. And that Clérambault, the French psychiatrist, who Lacan says was his only master, and is the one that told him to go study Freud when he was just a psychiatrist, had an idea of this too. And he said that that people incorporated a whole history of behaviors, behavioral postures, positions, symptoms, reactions, phraseologies into the genome, and that they were present, and that of course most individuals will be, you call these automatisms, and most individuals will, as babies, are more in touch with those, and a lot of them are common, and we sort of joke about them and don't know what they are, and it doesn't matter because we're basically teaching or programming the child in our own little private cultural and familial languages, and also to build themselves an ego of choice, which is important and essential. And to the degree that they don't build that familial, cultural self and ego, they can fall back on the primitive automatisms of the phylogenesis. So he believed that psychosis, in a sense, was only the point where the familial social programming broke down, and even, well, first of all, the sense of the self broke down, if there ever was that level for that individual. And then falling back on the next level, the social familial programming broke down. Finally, they fell back on the last remnant, which is a series of automatisms that are phylogenetic, and that a good psychiatrist or psychoanalyst would have to really observe and listen to the patient to see where are the phylogenetic automatisms, and where is the secondary reconstruction of those automatisms into behaviors, and to separate those two things so that the subject will cover and interpret and make sense of the phylogenetic automatisms of the real that they're experiencing. I was saying all that because I also think it happens at the biological level, that there are phylogenetic symptoms that are encoded and learned, and there's a learning process and positive mutations of our bodies through viruses and other pathogens. And also it's unpleasant oftentimes, and we're fighting them or denying them or constructing myths and ideologies about them. So again, I'm pleading for reason and logic, to have the curiosity and to look at this event and the virus, and not to too quickly build myths that have nothing to do with what's going on. Any other questions from anyone that hasn't spoken yet? I'm not sure if these were leftovers or not. Okay. I'm going to lower all the hands to reset it. Now, if anybody has any comments or questions. Okay. Malik.
Actually, my tongue is tied, even though I've been wanting to speak this whole time.
Sorry.
um, I just wanted to bring up, you said this is a sci-fi era. I think you brought that up earlier in the talk. And the last comment made me think of Frank Herbert's book, Dune, which is kind of a messianic piece of literature, but it's all about accessing our genes and the collective knowledge that is stored there. And so that's just what came up in the conversation.
Mm. What was the last thing you said? Sorry, I was distracted by looking at some of the comments at the same time. About Dune, what was the last sentence or two?
Yeah, so Frank Herbert's book Dune it's basically a messianic novel. It's about a messiah figure.
Okay.
And in their world, women, witches, basically can access their genetic knowledge,
right,
but only along the women's channel.
Okay.
This messianic figure comes along and he can access all the knowledge, both the women's line and the men's line.
Okay.
And so that's just what was triggered by the conversation about the virus, and that the fact that that we have lots of viral data and that viruses are just data.
Right.
And so if it's all data all the time, if the universe is just a giant storm of data and we are some sort of aggregator of data, we are a narrator across the data almost.
Mm-hmm.
Can we use choice? Can we collectively choose to narrate the data together, not unconsciously? Because in my life I've experienced so much unconscious narration that I'm kind of pissed off about it. But no, I all of my wounding and all of my trauma is around collective narratives that just don't really take care of people. Can we start to take this data, our genetic data, and also the constant stream of universal data? Can we take that and generate a narrative that like just takes care of all the people? Because we're not feeding like more than 1 billion or more than 2 billion people, they're not getting the food, and yet all the food's there. We can produce more food than we can eat.
Hold on, don't go so fast.
Sorry.
Yeah, no, I agree with you up to a certain point, and then I think you went off in a well-meaning direction.
All right, that's fine.
You forecast what you triggered something that I forgot to say that I wanted to say. You went there, which is absolutely. This is what I mean by between the sign and the signifier. We're between the sign. There's codes everywhere. That's a sign. Every code is a sign. There's infinity of signs around. A signifier is only human. Only humans produce signifiers. A signifier is a sign that has meaning. But the important thing is not that it has meaning. Everybody's trying to read signs as if they were signifiers. Humans produce and receive signifying signs, and then they try to go into the world of signs and make them mean something, but they mean nothing. So the key is that about a signifier is not that it means something and a sign doesn't. The key is choice. You said it. It's all about choice. A signifier is the power of choice and dominion that a human has over the rest of the codes and the signs. That doesn't mean that he's not going to make a wrong choice that's going to hurt other signs or other parts of the universe, but he has that capability so that minerals, plants, and animals circulate through signs, but they don't have free will. They can't make a choice or an act. The human has the level of that, which essentially is what is meant by karma, which doesn't mean what people think it means, that it's some kind of account book. That's drawing karma back into what it isn't. Karma means act or action, and it means that humans have that ability that other parts of the universe don't, to make choice and free will. And in fact, as long as you're following anybody else's model, your parents, your culture, your teachers, you're not engaging in the human aspect of karma or dominion. once you make a choice and an act, of course, learning and observing the world, all of it, learning from your elders, your wisdom, your culture, observing animals, plants, that all leads you to make a better choice, an act of free will, but only at that. Nothing, all of that can lead you up to the act, but the act is always just the act, and that's it. Everything happens after that. You make the act, you make the choice, the one you want, the best you can. And the second part is you have to try to learn from that act and then make another act, another choice that refines your path, your desire. That's why I was saying you're going too fast, because it has to spiral down from the collective, the mass of minerals, plants, and animals to the absolute act, even beyond the ego self, to the act of that moment where everything that's happened in the universe and in your own life leads up to that act, a real act. That's a karmic act. If we were engaging in karmic acts together, we would be evolving and transforming the universe and our society. So in a sense, this is about that, because it's in these times of crisis when you're faced up with war or pandemic that you're forced to engage at the level of karma and the act. And that's why it's so regenerating and refreshing for the individual and the society. This is something different than the sacred. It's another take on it. It's about the karmic act of being in existence, what you're here for, what you possess as a human spirit, rather than something else. So we're forced to the karmic act of free will and choice. I'm saying that the true meaning of the practice of psychoanalysis is this, which is also called ethics. Ethics is about making an act beyond morality. You can learn, you can study other ways of doing things. You can try to follow other moralities to learn up to a certain point, but only when you start engaging in your own acts do you enter the realm of ethics. An ethical act is beyond morality, beyond somebody else's idea. But it's also only ethical. Doing something just because it's against the morality or the norm is not ethical. Doing something because it is what you believe and it is different from or against what is the norm or the morality is ethical. But also, to follow that process and practice, you listen to the response. You take the feedback of it. Of course, karmically, it would say that you don't really have to if you don't want to. I mean, something else or someone else might be destroyed. You will be destroyed ultimately. Even if you think it's something else, it will be destroyed. If you're making choices and destroying your family or your earth, you might not care for a moment, but it'll teach you in the end that you do care, that there is an interconnectedness. So I guess all I'm trying to say is what we need to be focusing on is that karmic act and the response and listening of its repercussions. And it sounds great to say that, yeah, we could just be doing all this for everybody, but it's more complicated than that, because however you want to engage in just helping everyone in a certain way doesn't necessarily work for someone else. So there's no way around it other than that we engage in a series of acts together and try to figure it out in some way.
I think the critical word that I heard from you was choice. And one thing that I found is that as I walk through life, although I have choice in every moment, I'm asleep a lot of the time. And so when I'm asleep, I'm not really making choices. Mm-hmm. Then when life events happen that throw me into a state of transition, those are the times where I can make choices. I think one of the callers talked about the dystopia, anti-dystopia kind of. And so transitions, we often consider them not great, right? You know, you're moving, or you lost your job, or you got sick. But those are the moments where we wake up for a minute. And mm-hmm. those are the moments where we really have choice. I think we always have choice. We're just kind of like when you're driving to work and all of a sudden you're there. You made a lot of choices along the way. You couldn't tell you were making them. And so were they really choices?
Yeah, exactly. That's also, again, I'm not trying to sell psychoanalysis as it is, because as it is, it's not always easy to defend. It's degenerated in a lot of ways. But I found in its essence and truth from Freud onward, it carries so much of this as a practice for the modern man, as a spiritual, ethical practice that's completely atheological. It contains these things, which, as I say in the blurb, it depends on anamnesis, which is a Greek term, double negative. It means to unforget, to remember what was forgotten, to keep waking up. So the process is to first start by trying to remember not to forget, and then, which is more well known in what psychoanalysis is about. The second part, which unfortunately isn't really a part of it enough, which I'm trying to stress in a reteaching of a practice that I'm trying to call analysis rather than psychoanalysis, to make it more simply open to everyone, is the act and the construction. That the forgetting of your traumas, your compromises on your desire, et cetera, eventually has to lead to a new act, to new acts and new creations and new constructions that involve risk. And that's the hard part. So that's what I'm saying is this third principle of the analyst, or whatever that is. It's anyone who helps someone, as a doctor, teacher, friend, lover of a certain type, that you facilitate the possibility of this act and this construction to take place. Otherwise, it can just stagnate into unforgetting, remembering, waking up, etc. So choice and free will and the act is essential.
So is it possible coronavirus is providing an opportunity for a collective unforgetting?
Absolutely.
What are we unforgetting then?
I'm not sure. I guess I gave some ideas during the talk. I'm open to anybody else. If anybody else wants to raise their hand, if that question triggers anything for anybody, if they have an alternative take on what they think we're unforgetting, or what one of many things that we're unforgetting. Well, okay then. We've gone over time, which is great because everybody seemed really inspired. I guess we can sort of begin to draw it to a close. We would usually have like through Analytica, our institute is open and closed, and we have internal members that are following a more dedicated process of clinical work and training their own work as analyzans. But also we do open events, and previously it was often physical and with virtual capability. Now it's sort of shifted to being more virtual, and we're just sort of in the process. We were just in the transitional process of relaunching this, both for members and the public in general, as ongoing events. So if you're new to this, if you're interested in becoming more involved as a member or clinical or training or whatever, go to our website, analytica.org. If you just want to be on the list and you're not on it, so you'll get notices of also public events. And we're opening up a sort of discussion list area as well. Do that, and you feel free to follow up with me personally. As I said, I gave you my email. It's been really great. Of course, strangely, had a huge audience, huger than a lot of live events. And I mean, I already saw that coming in recent years, that there was so much going on outside. People were just exhausted. And so for all of its drawbacks, maybe exploring this virtual aspect and all the benefits of it can be exciting. So I'm going to end the meeting, and hope to talk to you soon.